A School Story by M.R. James. The story doesn't begin in a school. It begins in a railway waiting room, where two gentlemen were passing the time while they waited for their trains to arrive by reminiscing and telling each other stories about their days at boarding school. "I remember," said the first man, "at my school we had a ghost's footprint on the staircase. Never forgotten it. Stone step, square heel. But none of the boys ever invented a story about it, which is odd, really. Boys are always inventing stories about ghosts of one kind or another." "Ah, yes," said the second gentleman, "but I should imagine that if you were to examine most of those tales, they would all end up just being edited versions, cut-down versions from books and magazines, nothing more or less, not a word of truth in any of them. Still, jolly good fun. I seem to remember," the man went on, "at my school the head prefect would creep in at night when we were all supposed to be sleeping, and he would carry a candle on a small saucer in front of him so that it threw flickering shadows up against the wall behind him. We would gather around as quietly as we could because, of course, we were all meant to be sleeping. And he would usually begin his tale with a I remember my favourite story that he told us was one about a house with a particular room in which a series of people all insisted on passing a night. And in the morning, when they were discovered, they were crouching down and had just enough time to say, 'I've seen it,' before they died." "Oh, I can do better than that," said the second man. "Same sort of situation. Head boy coming in late at night into the dormitory to tell us all a story. There's one he told which I've never forgotten. Yes, he said. A man was staying in a country hotel, and he had just locked the door behind him and secured the windows, getting ready for bed, when all of a sudden, from high up in one corner of the room, he heard a thin, reedy voice saying, 'Now we're shut in for the night.' But there was nobody there. I wonder if they go on still, these kind of stories." Now there was a third gentleman in the waiting room that day. So far he hadn't said anything at all, merely stood by the door, looking out onto the platform, waiting for his own train to arrive. But when he heard these words, "I wonder if they go on still, these kind of stories," he did speak for the first time in a low, quiet voice, saying, "I could tell you a ghost story set in a school. There is no real sequel, no explanation to it, gentlemen, as far as I can tell, and yet it will suffice for some entertainment if you would like to hear it." "Oh, yes, do go ahead," they said. So the man began. "Well, the school that I'm referring to was the one I attended in London some 30 years ago. Oh, it was a splendid building. Red brick with ivy climbing up the outside of one of the library walls. A fine set of trees up beyond the sports pavilion and the playing fields. A very, very pleasant place for a boy to receive his education. Although, of course, at the time we boys never admitted as much. A boy will never admit his school has any pleasant or even tolerable features. Well, when I arrived as a new boy, there were many more starting for the first time as well. One of them was a Scottish boy from the Highlands, a boy called MacLeod. Now MacLeod and I soon became the best of friends. He wasn't particularly gifted at either his books, his studies, or indeed at games, and yet we just suited each other down to the ground. Sat together in class, shared the same dormitory, his bunk above mine. And I remember MacLeod and I had been at the school some 2 or maybe 3 terms, for I do remember it was about a year, when a new teacher, a new master arrived. His name was Samson. And as the name suggests, Samson was a very tall, broad, thick-set man with a thick, bushy beard, piercing green eyes that seemed to stare straight through you. I remember that we boys liked Samson a good deal. You see, he had travelled a lot, and he had a whole fund of stories which he enjoyed telling to us. On one occasion I was helping Samson to carry his books from one room to another. When we reached the room and I'd put the books down, I remarked upon a chain around Samson's neck with something attached to it. He took it off and allowed me to take a closer look. The object on the chain must have been some sort of old coin, because there on one side there was carved, in profile, the head of some absurd old king or emperor, much as you would see on any coin of the realm nowadays. But the other side of the coin, that had been worn perfectly smooth, and upon that side Samson had carved his own initials. I remember it now as if I were looking at it. GWS, and with a date as well. The 24th of July, 1865. Now, the whole thing must have been about the size of a florin, or perhaps a little bit larger. I handed it back to Samson and thanked him for letting me look at it. The reason I mention Samson in such detail is because he figures so strongly in the story I'm about to relate. In fact, the first unusual incident happened in one of Samson's Latin classes. I know that nowadays not as many people study the old language, Latin, but in those days, of course, well, we all did. Now, Samson's favourite method of teaching was to give us a word. On this occasion it was memere, to remember. And we boys had to invent a sentence using that word and write it down in Latin. Now, of course, this method of teaching will give some boys no end of an opportunity for mischief, to write down something rude or impertinent. But Samson, he was far too good a disciplinarian for anyone to even consider trying that. Well, we'd all finished. We'd written down perfectly dull, ordinary things such as, I remember my father, or he remembered his books, that kind of thing. Except the boy that I was mentioning earlier, MacLeod, my friend. Well, so far he hadn't written anything at all. I glanced at his paper, and it was completely blank. He was staring into the middle distance. Well, I nudged him with my elbow and told him to look sharp. You're keeping us all waiting. But he didn't seem to attend. So then the boy sitting opposite, Jennings, I seem to remember his name was, well, Jennings reached under the desk and kicked MacLeod sharply in the shins. As you can imagine, this did have some effect. Well, he picked up his pen, scribbled down 2 or 3 lines, and handed it in with the rest. Now, because MacLeod's paper was the final one to be handed in, it was the final one to be marked. The bell had rung for morning break before Samson had even got halfway through. Well, we were all running towards the door when Samson called back, MacLeod, here, please. And my friend had to wait until he'd finished marking the papers as a punishment for being so slow. Well, when I got out that morning, there wasn't much going on the fields, so I doubled back to the schoolhouse to wait for my friend. He was several minutes, and when he did come out, he'd gone quite pale. Hello, I said, what's wrong? What did you get? Meaning, of course, what mark had Samson given him for his work. Well, I'm not really sure, he replied, but I think Samson's rather sick with me. Why, I said, did you show him some rot? And by rot, of course, I meant had my friend written anything rude or impertinent at which Samson had taken offence. Well, no, it was all perfectly correct as far as I could tell. It was memento. Well, that was the right form to use for remember. Memento putae inter quator taxos. That does sound strange, I said. What does it mean? Well, there's a strange thing, he said. I'm not really sure I know what it means. I have a kind of an idea, because just before I jotted it down, a sort of a picture came into my head. I think it means, remember the well in the middle of the he said, now what are those trees with the bright shiny leaves and the red berries? You're thinking of yew trees, I said. That's right. Remember the well in the middle of the 4 yew trees. It sounds all right to me, I said, even if it is a little strange. What did Samson say? Nothing at all. At first he turned away from me and he leant up against the fireplace in the corner of the room. And then after a moment he turned back on me. You know those eyes he's got, the way they seem to stare straight through you? Well, he came back with what do you suppose that means, boy? Well, I tried to answer him, but I couldn't remember the name of the blasted trees. And then he began asking me all sorts of other questions, things like, well, where did my parents come from? How long had I been at the school? That kind of thing. And at long last he let me come away, but I tell you, he didn't look at all well. Now, whether Samson really had been disturbed at what my friend had written, of course neither of us went up to ask him. Well, he was a teacher, after all. You didn't ask teachers that kind of thing, not in my day. And when we next saw Samson, which was the following day, he seemed to be perfectly back to normal. Indeed, 2 or even 3 weeks went by before anything else strange or untoward happened again. But when it did, it was once again in one of Samson's Latin classes. Now, on this occasion, we were doing those dreadful things called conditional sentences with a future consequence. I'm sure you'll know the sort of thing I mean. The sort of sentence which runs like this: if we were to do this, then we could do that. Or if she were late arriving, then we would have to wait for her. You see, a future consequence in Latin. Well, this time we had all finished, including MacLeod, and we'd all handed our papers in. Samson was at his desk, marking. Very good, Petersfield, splendid, very good, well done. Yes, not bad, yes, good, good. Not bad, Walker, well done, yes. But then he came to one particular paper. Which one? Who wrote? How dare you? And making a strange choking sound, he staggered from his chair and ran out of the room. Goodness me, I thought. Somebody's written down something really rude. He's gone to get the head teacher. But he didn't return. We waited several minutes, and then myself and 1 or 2 of the other boys, I suppose it was wrong of us to do this, but we went up to the table to have a look. That topmost piece of paper was written on in red ink, which none of the boys were supposed to use. But not only that, it wasn't of any boy's handwriting, of anyone in the class. Each boy came up in turn and swore an oath it wasn't his, including my friend MacLeod. Well, then I had the idea of counting those pieces of paper. And of this I made quite sure because I checked twice. There were 17 pieces of paper on the desk, and only 16 boys in the class. Well, I bagged that extra piece of paper and I kept it for myself. And I believe, gentlemen, the man continued, I still have it amongst my papers even to this day. But now, he said, going on, by now they were rapt with attention, hanging on his every word. Now, he said, I suppose you'll want to know what it was that was written on the piece of paper. Well, yes, yes. Do tell us, they said. Well, it was simple enough and innocent enough as far as I could tell, the man continued. It was, si tu non veneris ad me, ego veniam ad te. I'm awfully sorry, said one of the men. It's been many years since I studied the old language. You'll have to translate it for me. The memory's a little bit rusty. Yes, of course, he said. Si tu non veneris ad me, ego veniam ad te, roughly translated, means, if you don't come to me, then I will come to you. You said you'd kept that piece of paper, said the other gentleman. I should very much like to examine it one day, if I could. Yes, yes, I'd happily show it to you, he said. But it wouldn't do you any good, I'll tell you why. Later on that day, I went to my locker where I'd hidden the paper away. I wanted to take another look. I took it out. Now I know that it was the same piece of paper, because there down in one corner I noticed a thumb mark which I'd made earlier. But now there wasn't anything written on it at all. Well, over the years I've tried various experiments to see if some kind of invisible ink had been used, but all to no effect. Well, to go back to that morning in the classroom, after some 20 minutes or so, Samson did come back in. He looked very sheepish when he did. He apologised, saying he'd come over feeling very ill all of a sudden. He edged towards the desk and looked down fearfully. But of course that topmost piece of paper, the one that had been written on in red ink, well, it was now safely tucked away in my pocket on its way to its hiding place in my locker. Now, That day was a half-holiday, and so we didn't see Sampson again until the following day, when once again he seemed to be back to normal. But the following night, the third and final incident in my story occurred. I've already mentioned MacLeod and I shared the same dormitory, which was at right angles to the main building of the school. Our window looked straight across the courtyard to where the teachers had their own private sleeping quarters and studies. Our window was opposite Sampson's on the first floor. I'd stayed up quite late that night. I knew I had some reading to catch up with. I'd catch it hot from the history master if I didn't read at least another 3 chapters. I'd fallen dreadfully behind. But the inevitable happened. My eyelids grew heavy. The book soon slipped from my fingers, and before too long, I was fast asleep. At some time between 1 and 2 in the morning, I was woken by somebody roughly shaking me by the arm. It was MacLeod. "What on earth is the matter?" "Shh, don't make a sound. Come and look. Someone's trying to break in at Sampson's window." "Well, then we should raise the alarm." I said, No, hush, hush," said MacLeod. "I'm not sure who it is, but come and look." Well, naturally enough, I went and looked. And naturally enough, by the time I got there was no one to be seen. Well, by now I was angry enough at MacLeod for having disturbed my sleep in such a fashion, and for no good purpose. But then, just as I was about to criticise him for it, I got the feeling that there was something dreadfully wrong. Something that made me awfully glad I wasn't there alone to face it. So in a hushed voice I asked MacLeod exactly what it was he had heard and seen. "I didn't hear anything at all," he replied. "But just a minute before I came to wake you, I found myself at the window here looking out, and there," he said, crouched down on the window ledge and peering into his room, into Sampson's room, there was the figure of a man, and he seemed to be beckoning like that." "What sort of a man?" I asked him. "Well, I'm not really sure, but he was beastly thin, and he seemed to be wet all over. And what's more," said MacLeod, lowering his voice even further, as if he hardly even dare hear himself speak, "I'm not at all sure if it was alive." Well, MacLeod and I carried on talking in hushed voices for several minutes. During the whole time, nobody else awoke or even stirred in their beds. We made our way back to our own bunks, and I think I must have got some fitful sleep between 4 and 5 in the morning, but as you can imagine, I wasn't much use for anything the next day. And next day, Sampson had gone, vanished without trace. And I believe no sight nor sound has ever come to light of him since. But you know, gentlemen, in telling you this story today, the strangest thing of all seems to me to be the fact that when we boys were asked questions about Sampson's disappearance, and as you can imagine, many questions were asked around the school, the police were called in to investigate the matter. But during that whole investigation, neither MacLeod nor I said anything at all about what he had seen that night. It wasn't as if we were being secretive or wicked. No, it was more as if a cold, wet hand had suddenly clamped itself over our mouths, preventing us from speaking of it. And I do believe that's my train," said the gentleman. "Well, that is the end of my story in any event. As I said, there's no sequel, no explanation to it, but I hope it's entertained you, gentlemen, and I hope you both have a pleasant voyage. Farewell." And with that, the man was gone. But today, I can tell you, the story does have a kind of a sequel, a sort of an explanation to it. Because some 6 months after hearing it, one of those 2 gentlemen who were listening to the story that day was visiting a friend of his who owned a country estate in Yorkshire. It was the final night of his visit, and he and his friend had just got back after a splendid supper in the town. And his friend said, "Now, you're interested in antiquity. You're interested in antiquity." He said, "You like old things. Have a look at this here and see if you can explain it." And he reached into a drawer. He took out a small box and handed it to the man. He opened it and took out a chain with something attached. "Where did you get this?" he asked his friend. "Well, there's a strange story behind it," he replied. "You remember earlier in the year we were clearing out the bottom fields, and there was a clump of 3 or 4 yew trees getting completely overgrown, so we decided to cut them down. When we did, we found a well in the middle of the yew trees we never even knew existed." "And what do you think we found at the bottom of the well?" "Is it possible?" the man asked. "Is it possible that you found a body?" "We did indeed. But more than that, in every sense of the word, we found 2. Gracious! 2 bodies, yes. Terrible history it must have been, whatever the story behind it. One of the chaps had his arm sort of clenched tight around the other fella as if to stop him from escaping. And was this chain and coin found with the bodies?" "Yes. It was still tangled up in what was left of the neckerchief of the other fella. Oh, terrible business. As you can imagine, we had that well filled in pretty sharpish after that, eh?" And do you know anything else?" "Well, no. I dread to think of it, really, but your eyesight's better than mine," he said. "Can you make out what's carved on the back of that coin there?" "Yes, I think I can make it out," the man said. "I think it reads GWS, the 24th of July, 1865.